guys. Today is going to be a bit different. Let me refresh my stream over here, get some chat going on. Not planned flight sims today. As some of you guys know, I've been working on my flight instructor rating, CFI, trying to get that done. And one of the challenges has been going back and having to teach some of the principles of flight that I think at this point in my flying career I kind of understand intuitively, but trying to teach them in a digestible way to somebody who's not an aviation aficionado or a pilot. Because some of these things, they seem kind of obtuse. And even that, between the difference between my private pilot license and my commercial pilot license, I think even my understanding of some of these things has increased. Particularly as I've been trying to make lessons to teach them to somebody else. So what I'm going to do today, and what I want from you, is I'm going to go through and we're going to talk about the principles of flight, primarily airfoils, angle of attack, possibly some turning tendencies, load factor, and drag. And if you guys, you're my target audience too. You guys, you have some familiarity with flight sims or aviation, but you might not know some of the intricacies. So you're exactly who I want to talk to. So if you guys can understand this and this is digestible to you, leave me a comment if you're watching on YouTube and let me know. And if you're watching live in chat, feel free to ask any questions because that's exactly what I need to be doing now. And one of the first hard ones that I had to teach. So basically what I'm doing is I have a giant notebook that's just full of all these lessons, and I have to go teach those to my instructor, who then he pretends to be the stupid kid who just doesn't get it. So I'll say something which I think is clear, and then he says, okay, I don't get it. So then I got to think of a different way to describe something. So that's what I'm going to try to do today. If you guys have any questions, let me know. We are going to start with the 4 forces of flight. Let me go back to my little paint pad over here. We can draw a picture. So if this is our airplane, here's the longitudinal axis. Here's the vertical stabilizer. So nose and tail, we've got 4 forces that act on the airplane. Obviously the first one, lift. And they all act in coordination with each other, so lift and weight. Pardon my writing and drawing. It's hard to do this with mouse. And of course, 2 more. We've got forward force is thrust. And of course, thrust is in opposition to drag. And there's 2 types of drag, which I'll talk about in a second once we get past AOA, because those are all related to each other and different for different phases of flight. So there's a couple of bits of terminology and stuff that we need. You've got lift, weight, thrust, and drag. And in normal, unaccelerated flight, all 4 of these forces are in equilibrium, right? So if we're traveling straight and level, our lift is equaling the weight of the aircraft, meaning the lift that we're producing with our airfoil, the wings, and the angle of attack. These things are equal. And our thrust is equal to the amount of drag that we're creating. So for example, at low speeds, less thrust, but we're going to have more drag because we're going to have a higher AOA. Let me get a new one here. So the primary thing that we're working with is called an airfoil, which I'm sure that all you guys are familiar with, and it looks something like this. Again, pardon the drawing skills. The upper surface and the lower surface. In this area in the front, the rounded edge that faces forward in flight, this is called the leading edge. Just abbreviate that for us. And then, of course, we've got the trailing edge back here. And in between those things, there's an imaginary line that connects the leading edge to the trailing edge, and this is called a chord line. Give me back my brush, please. Chord is in like guitar chord, C-H-O-R-D, chord line. It's imaginary, it's not a real thing. But the way that the chord line works, this is how we measure angle of attack, which is something that I'm sure that you've all heard, particularly if you're into combat flight simulators like DCS. So the angle of attack, we've got our relative wind. This is the motion of the wind or airfoil is traveling towards, right? So the difference between the chord line here and the relative motion of the wind, it makes a delta, right? A difference between, so this would be the angle, the top line would be the angle of our chord line in relation to the bottom line being the relative motion of the wind. And this angle of difference is called your angle of attack. I don't know why I'm writing all this out. Just call it AOA for short. AOA is all you need to remember. And the airfoil works with, I mean, we're talking about aerodynamics. Even though air is a gas, we consider it a liquid, basically, or fluid, right? And so the airfoil works to, I guess, basically take advantage of surface reactions, like from a fluid. So I got this guy. Let me erase some of this stuff here. So if you just look at the airfoil, one of the things that you'll notice is the top is more curved than the bottom, right? But the airfoil, the entire airfoil is moving through the air at the same speed. But we have a difference in camber between the top and the bottom. The top is more curved, the bottom is straighter, which means that air particles along the bottom are moving slower than they are over the top. I'm just going to illustrate here. We'll draw a little airfoil. This is a fluid dynamics simulator. It's not the best thing in the world. And even at the lowest viscosity, it's kind of hard to make it look like air. So we can draw an airfoil here. And if we start our, let's go velocity. So if you look at the particles, I don't know how easy that is to see on stream. The particles that are at the leading edge and over the top of the wing are being accelerated because of the camber. It's curved at the top and straight at the bottom. So this, in terms of aerodynamics, we use something called Bernoulli's principle. And Bernoulli was this guy who, this is called a venturi. He discovered that with fluids, as we accelerate a fluid, the pressure decreases. So in this venturi, right, here's the original velocity and the original pressure. As we contract these things, we're speeding up the velocity inside the venturi, inside the throat of the venturi. And you can see the difference in pressure here. So the entrance to the venturi, pressure is higher than it is where we're compressing this fluid, where it's moving faster, right? So these same principles apply to aerodynamics. So if we go back to this, obviously we're accelerating particles over the top of the wing, and these are relatively even. They're lower speed, higher speed. So on the upper end of the upper surface of the wing, because we're accelerating those particles, we're creating lower pressure at the top. And below, because there's not much of a difference, this is relatively high pressure. So there's two areas of differential pressure, low and high. Upper surface is low pressure, and the lower surface is high pressure. So that difference in pressure allows us to create lift, basically. Let's see. And the way that we can influence lift, let me clear this. We will pause that, reset the fluids, by increasing our angle of attack. Run this again. We're actually increasing those pressures, those pressure differentials, right? So if we increase the angle of attack, we're accelerating particles even further over the upper end of the wing because now they have to travel an even further distance. And these are decelerating because now there's less of an angle of incidence between the relative airflow and the chord line, right? So lower speed now on the bottom and even higher speed than there was before. And so we're increasing those speeds. And if you see like fighter jets, if they pull back on the control stick and you see that big vapor zone above the wings, that's because of the Bernoulli principle, right? Because another thing is that as we lower the pressure, we also decrease temperature. So in these pressure zones, you would be decreasing the temperature, which basically condenses the air. I'm sure some of you guys might be familiar. You got temperature and dew point. If we can cool the air to the dew point, at that point it saturates the air and water vapor will condense, which is what is happening. You're just cooling the air instantaneously in that low pressure zone above the airfoil, and you're creating a cloud, which is all it is. So Bernoulli principle is like the primary thing that explains lift. It's differential pressure. And we talked about that in relation to the angle of attack. And stalls, right? So I'm sure that you guys are all familiar with stalls, particularly if you play flight simulators, you've had it happen to you. And I think that the basic answer that you get often to what is a stall is like when you go too slow, which is kind of true. But really what it is you've exceeded what's called the critical angle of attack. And I can show you that more precisely if we stop our fluid here. Let's go reset, pause, reset, clear that. And the curl will show us the difference in flow from top to bottom. So let's say we have a really extreme angle of attack. So here's our airfoil. let's start our simulation. Just like in weather, I'm sure that you guys have heard this before, air moves from high pressure to low pressure. So we obviously know that the air below the wing is high pressure, and the air above the wing is low pressure. So what happens, especially if we speed this up, now you can see the airflow over the top of the wing has separated, right? Let me see if we can get this to work here. We need an even more extreme angle of attack. Bam, look at this. So now the high pressure air is flowing, it's spilling over onto the upper surface of the wing, completely separating the airflow over the top of the wing, so it's removing those centers of pressure. It just kills your lift. So that's how stall works. Stall is nothing more than exceeding the critical angle of attack. And every airplane has a specific angle of attack, a number of degrees or whatever it is, that once you deflect past that region, it's going to separate airflow on the top and the bottom portions of the wing, and you're going to stall. So that's what the critical angle of attack is. Let's clear that, reset, and we'll stop. The other thing too is that we have a regular neutral AOA. Your center of pressure is generally going to be straight up. You're creating a lift vector kind of about here on the wing. If we clear that and pause, let's do a negative angle of attack. Now because you see here's the relative direction of airflow. Now we're pushing those particles faster along the bottom, so we're creating low pressure here. We've changed the center of pressure. We moved it from this portion all the way to the underside, which is why we descend. And it's the same thing too with when we're ascending. We're moving the center of pressure to the forward point of the wing. So normally in a neutral AOA for a normal level flight, it would be towards the center of like the 25% chord line. And as we increase the AOA, that center of pressure moves forward, which is why we climb. But deflection of deflection of flight instruments and increasing the AOA, obviously that's how we climb. But it also creates something called induced drag, which means lift-induced drag. So AOA is how we increase lift. And imagine if you're driving in a car and you've got your hand out the window and your hand is horizontal to the ground, right? And if you increase the angle of attack of your hand, meaning you lift up your thumb, right, into the leading edge, you're creating a higher angle of attack. Now you're changing the zones of pressure and your hand does what? It starts to lift. It works exactly the same way as an airfoil does. But you can also feel when you do that, it increases resistance, drag. It'll push your hand back, right? So that's what induced drag is. Induced drag versus parasitic drag. So parasitic drag, again, imagine just putting your hand back out the window, neutral AOA. Just by virtue of the fact that your hand is moving through the air, it's creating resistance. So if we clear this, pause and reset our fluid, we'll just do, and let's go velocity again. So we're increasing the velocity, that's increasing drag at your thumb, basically the leading edge of your hand airfoil, right? And the faster that we go, the more induced drag, the more parasitic drag is being created. So we got this little chart here. The bottom, the x-axis would be your flight velocity, it means your airspeed. The y-axis is your drag force. So obviously the slower that we're going, in order to compensate and to create the lift that we need at low air speeds, we need to have a higher AOA. Meaning, for example, like you're coming in for a landing. Let's go back to our paint pad here. Before you put your flaps out, your plane is probably going to look something like this, right? Because the slower that we go, the more we're going to have to bring that nose up, and the more of an angle of incidence, our angle of attack is going to increase. So we have a high induced drag because we're creating a bunch of lift with this angle of attack at low air speeds, which we can see here. So the slower that we go, the more induced drag that we have. Conversely, as we start to speed up, right, imagine your hand sticking back out of the window. Or for example, if you've got a fixed gear, a fixed landing gear airplane, those, they're going to stay into the airflow, right? So the faster that we go, the more drag is going to be produced on those structures, which you can see here. So parasitic drag increases as speed increases, and conversely, lift-induced drag decreases with speed increase. Why? Because again, if we're looking at our little flight guy here, the faster that we go, the lower the angle of attack is going to be, right? So let's say you take off with no flaps. Your rotate speed is 60 miles an hour. You're going to have a relatively high angle of attack. Once you're off the ground and the airspeed continues to increase, the angle of attack is going to decrease, right? So we're reducing the induced drag as the airplane speeds up. Once we get past a certain threshold and we continue to speed up, then parasitic drag is going to take over as the primary thing that's slowing you down, which is what we're seeing with this graph over here, right? So this area right here would be your best flight speed for endurance, meaning this is the lowest amount of total drag that you're ever going to have in flight. So usually we would say, okay, your best cruise speed, which is dependent on weights and center of gravity and all those things, is going to be here at the minimum amount of total drag, which is just where these two lines of parasitic and lift-induced drag coincide. Hopefully, that makes some sense. You guys are super quiet, so maybe if you're watching on YouTube, let me know if that works. I hope you guys understand the difference between parasitic drag, induced drag, what angle of attack is, and how that works with the Bernoulli principle to create differential pressure, right? That's how an airfoil works. Bernoulli principle is like the private pilot answer when the examiner says, well, how does an airplane create lift, right? You would explain the Bernoulli's principle, but there's a couple of other things that we use as well. Going into Newton's first, second, and third laws, those are all related to like principles of flight. So the first law being every object persists in its state of rest or uniform motion until it's compelled by change by other forces, right? So in flight, imagine, and again, we're going back to our little airplane. When we got the four forces of flight are in equilibrium: lift, weight, thrust, and drag. There's no change. But if we increase the thrust, right, it's going to make us accelerate. That's how Newton's first law applies. Newton's second law is force equals mass times acceleration. So again, we're accelerating mass through the air with thrust. We're creating forces. That one's pretty obvious. And then there's also Newton's third law, which is for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, which the biggest way that applies is probably with torque and in left-turning tendencies and stuff like that. Something else that's related to changes in pressure. If we go back to this guy, let's go to plot or curl. Again, I said air moves from high pressure to low pressure. And because the air is moving a further distance over the top, those particles are accelerating. So it's low pressure on top. And what's happening is that the high pressure air spills over onto the upper surface of the wing. And you can see this mixing force, right? At higher AOAs, it becomes worse. That's how wingtip vortices are created. That's what a wingtip vortices or a vortex is. And they typically move away from the fuselage towards the wingtip for a number of reasons, one being bow wave, for example. And at the wingtip, they're the worst. And these guys, they expand outwards and they descend. But when you're talking about wake turbulence, that's what this is. You're experiencing the vortices from planes that are in front of you. Pressure distributions, vortices. Plan form, it would be like describing wing shapes, which I think you guys can draw some of those, but that's a relatively simple concept. The shape of the wing is selected to achieve different things. And there's different types of wings. So here would be an example of what we call taper. So if this is the fuselage, this portion of the wing is the root, and this is the tip. If our chord line, and again, a chord line being the imaginary line that connects the leading edge and the trailing edge, right? If the chord line is the same distance to the root as it is at the tip, that means there's no taper, right? So if we had taper, the root or the wingtip would be a shorter chord line. Generally, the root stalls first, which gives more warning and control and stall recovery, particularly because our ailerons are usually on the outside of the wing surface. So if this portion stalls first, we still have control from our flight surfaces. We can still move the airplane a little bit. An aspect ratio is the length of the wing to the chord. So here's our chord. This is getting messy. The chord is obviously from leading edge to trailing edge, and the length would obviously be from the root to the tip. So a higher aspect ratio would be something like a glider or a B-52. And those are longer, they're narrower, they have less induced drag, but they create more lift. Smaller wingtips also means less vortices, which is why you see, in Cirrus, they're kind of curled up towards the back. It helps with pressure distribution and eliminates vortices, which decreases drag, right? Not having those two different pressure zones spilling over into each other is going to reduce the total amount of drag that we're getting. So you see, think about the Cirrus jets or the propeller planes. They have curled or pointed wingtips, and larger passenger planes, they have, the winglets. All of those are to minimize vortices, which increases, it would decrease drag, increasing your, total flight time and stuff like that. And a couple other things. Sweep, wing sweep. Let me get a new one here. So wing sweep would be the line that connects the 25% chord, meaning, here's our wing. 25% chord, meaning here's our chord line. 25% is here. Chord line, 25% is here. So that's your 25% chord line. Obviously, it can be forward. I can't remember the name of the aircraft, but there was an experimental airplane that had a forward sweep, but most of them are rearward sweeping, which helps in high-speed flight. Obviously, there's less drag if you have a wing sweep, but it also contributes to low-speed lateral stability because in this configuration, if the plane rolls, the lower wing has a higher AOA, which increases stability, which I'll get into in a second. New one, please. I don't think I'm going to go into longitudinal stability. That's like nose up and down. Lateral stability is a big one. You guys all know what center of gravity is, I'm assuming, if you're here for airplane stuff. We draw another airplane, fuselage, tail section. The center of gravity would simply be where if we were to balance the airplane on a fulcrum, at that point it would maintain balance, right? If we're talking about lateral stability, that means stability around a roll axis, meaning like this. If we're looking at the airplane from the front, so here's our fuselage and our wings. And lateral stability is contributed to by a couple of different factors. Let me go back for a second. I'm sorry, I'm all over the place. If we're looking at the airplane from the top down, so here's our tail, and here's the wing. In a turn, right, we're going to roll the plane. This wing ends up traveling this distance, right? The inner wing ends up traveling this distance. This is happening in the same amount of time. So in the same way that we have a curved surface on the upper end of, or the upper edge of the airfoil, we're increasing the airspeed, right? The same thing is happening. So we're increasing the airspeed of our outside wing, which is creating more more parasitic drag, which creates what's called, adverse yaw. Because we're increasing the drag, because this wing is traveling further and faster, there's more drag on the outside wing. We usually compensate with that with rudders. But there's a couple different ways that wing configurations contributes to minimizing adverse yaw. Right? The rudder pedals exist only in an airplane to counter adverse yaw. And the best way is, I'm sure you guys are familiar with the Cherokee, Piper Cherokee, Arrows, those types of planes that have low wings. They typically have what's called dihedral, where the wings are angled upwards. And like we were talking about a second ago with a swept wing, in this configuration, the low wing, like if this is our Cherokee, we start our right turn here, the low wing, because of this dihedral angle, is going to have a higher angle of attack. So remember, when we're increasing angle of attack, we're increasing induced drag. So in this configuration, we have a higher amount of drag on the outside wing because the velocity is higher in the turn, right? But at the same time, we're increasing the drag on the inside wing with increased angle of attack. So it compensates for adverse yaw. And in fact, in the Cherokees and low wing planes, sometimes I'm even giving it opposite rudder, which is how effective the dihedral wings are at minimizing adverse yaw. Like I've been, for example, in a left turn, giving it right rudder, which you would never do in most airplanes. They're really good at compensating for that. So it's easy to learn on a Cherokee, but if you're starting out, I would say do it in a high-winged plane, like a Cessna or something, to get you used to using rudder pedals. So that's dihedral. Sweepback we talked about. Sweepback works in exactly the same way. In a swept-backed airplane, the wing on the inside of the turn would have a higher angle of incidence, meaning it would be more perpendicular to the airflow, which creates more drag in exactly the same way. So again, you have a higher velocity of the outside wing during the turn, but because the inside wing is hitting the air at more perpendicular angle, it's increasing drag too. So there's more lateral stability or roll stability. And then there's one other way. So we've got dihedral, sweepback, and there's also something called Keel Effect, which is predominantly in aircraft like the Cessna. Keel on a boat, like if we're looking at the front of a boat, a keel would be that ribbed structure on the center that kind of maintains the boat's sort of vertical stability on the ocean. It keeps it from flipping and stuff like that. And in a Cessna, the fuselage works in kind of the same way, right? So if we're looking at the Cessna from the front, here's our high wing, here's the fuselage hanging down below the wing. There's a tendency in high wing aircraft to turn the longitudinal axis into the relative wind, meaning kind of like a weather vane. So lateral stability, because the wings are attached to a high position, makes the fuselage behave kind of like a keel on a boat in the same way. When a high wing plane is disturbed, one wingtip dips, right? The fuselage weight, it acts like a pendulum. So it returns the plane to level flight, basically. It's designed, so more weight of the keel area is above the CG, so when it slips, and that weight and airflow is changed, the pressure returns it to a normal attitude. This is very interesting. I hope so. I hope I'm doing a decent... I'm kind of all over the place with this stuff because I'm just trying to go through some of the things that I think were harder to understand. And I hope I'm explaining it in a way that you can digest. Because like I said, you guys are my target audience precisely. Like people who are, interested in aviation who might not understand some of the aerodynamic concepts behind it. Directional stability we talked about, that's only yawing. And again, we talked about the rudder. Your rudder is basically an airfoil. So here's the vertical stabilizer and the rudder. All we're doing with the rudder is changing the chord line. So for example, if we do a left deflection of the rudder, it goes left. Here's the leading edge, here's the trailing edge. We've changed the chord line of the wing, which is creating more lift on this side, more high pressure on this side, right? So we're controlling the lateral stability with the vertical fin. And again, it acts like a weather vane anyway. I'm not going to talk about directional oscillation. Another big thing are turning tendencies. So we talked about Newton's third law, which was every action has an equal and opposite reaction, right? So if we're in the cockpit looking out, here's our gauges and stuff. The propeller turns clockwise, right? So if we're on the ground, the propeller's turning clockwise because we're talking about Newton's third law. What happens? The plane has a tendency to roll away from that because of torque factor. It's kind of like a helicopter if you guys have flown one of those in the sim. As the propeller rotates to the right, the plane has a tendency to rotate to the left. So that translates in a couple of ways. One's very noticeable on the ground. So as we start our takeoff roll, here's the wings. Here's our landing gear. This is awful, by the way. So as the propeller is rotating to the right, the plane is rolling to the left, which creates a pressure in this direction. So we're increasing the amount of downforce on the left landing gear, which then increases drag on the left gear, which causes the plane to start to steer to the left. So when you start your takeoff roll, and we're full power or whatever, that's the max torque that you're going to have. It's pretty good. Neutral AOA. So it creates a lot of left turning tendency, which is why we use right rudder when we're taking off. Airborne has the same thing, but we can neutralize that with aileron. And again, it's mostly at high power settings. So as we get to cruise, level off, you reduce your power. It's not really noticeable. And in fact, most of the airplanes that I've flown don't even have aileron trim. It's mostly rudder and elevator. So I said on the ground, you get your takeoff roll, left turning tendency there. There's another one. Corkscrew effect, I'm not going to talk about. Gyroscopic action, I'm not going to talk about. One more, P factor. This is the big one. So your propeller is an airfoil, right? They both have their own twist, so they're creating an angle of attack. And they're twisted more at the inside as they are on the outside to create an even distribution of pressure. So if we look at this, this is our prop disc. That's viewed from behind, and if we look at it this way from profile on the side. So in normal level flight, the direction of airflow is hitting this perpendicular, right? But if we were to climb, we're going to change the angle of attack of the propeller. So it would look something more like this. During our climb profile, we have an increased angle of attack. And because the props, the blades are angled differently, most of the angle of attack is centered in this region. So the highest angle of attack, meaning where we're producing the most lift, or more precisely because it's horizontal, the most thrust, is in the lower right-hand quadrant. So if you're looking at the airplane from the top, here's our prop disc. Because the torque and that bite is coming from the right side, it has a tendency to rotate or to yaw the plane to the left, like that. So again, that's another one of the left turning tendencies. So you have your left turning tendency on the ground, which is caused by torque factor. Once we get airborne, it's P factor. But the same thing, it's gonna be right rudder pretty much all the way to your cruise altitude. Once we level off, that again, it equals the distribution of pressure on the prop disc. So it eliminates the P factor, and you can relieve your rudder pressure. What else do I want to talk about today? Talked about parasitic and induced drag. Load factor. Probably talk about that here too. Load factor. Load factor is centrifugal force, basically. Again, if we draw a plane from the front, in normal level flight, you can imagine that we have a lift vector that extends perpendicular from the fuselage up, right? So this is countering gravity. So if these things are in equilibrium, we get straight and level flight. It's all good. We turn the airplane by rolling it though, right? So here's our plane in a roll. What happens to the lift vector? Now it's at an angle. So weight is still bringing us this way, but now we're decreasing the total lift vector, and we're exchanging that for horizontal lift, right? That's how we turn the plane. So this horizontal lift is rotating the nose of the plane, which is how we're turning, but we've lost vertical lift. So in order to compensate, we do what? What up, Melon? How you doing? You guys, all you flight sim guys know exactly what's going on here. So when you roll the plane, what happens? You want to roll the plane in a turn, so we bank the plane. You have to increase back pressure on the controls, right? So when we increase the back pressure, we're using the elevator to create a higher angle of attack. It's going to increase the lift, right? And we're going to switch that weight vector centrifugally, especially if we're keeping the plane coordinated with the rudders. So it looks like this. We're going to maintain equilibrium. We're going to maintain altitude. That's what load factor is. It's the centrifugal force that's applied to the airplane in a turn. And obviously we do that with G's. It rolls, but it loses altitude when you roll, because we're decreasing the vertical lift in exchange for horizontal lift, if that makes sense. My drawings are terrible. I don't know if any of this... It's easier in real life when you can kind of go with a whiteboard. Really precisely, the load factor is the ratio of total air load acting on the airplane to the gross weight of the airplane. So meaning we have a gross weight of the airplane of 2,000 pounds in a 45-degree bank. In order to maintain a level altitude, you would need about 1.6 Gs. So it would be 2,000 times 1.6, which I'm not a math person. But would it be what? Somebody hit me up with a calculator. Hang on, I'll pull it up right quick. So in a 45-degree bank, your plane would end up weighing 3,200 pounds. And of course, the wing has to support that. So the primary reason that load factor is important is that there's an envelope that your plane can perform in without causing structural damage. For normal category airplanes, meaning that you're inside a certain CG envelope and weight envelope, that threshold is usually around 3.8 Gs, which I've never been anywhere near. I mean, even a 50-degree bank, you're talking about 1.6 Gs. I think at 90 degrees, it gets up there pretty fast. But yeah, and I think so. Normal G load for normal category would be 3.8. Utility aircraft, so a lighter load, more forward CG would be 4.4, and I think for acrobatic airplanes it's 6 Gs. And the other reason that's important too, so as we're turning, we're obviously increasing our angle of attack in order to maintain altitude because of load factor and because that the lift vector has changed directions and we're exchanging some of the vertical lift for horizontal lift. And so we talked about how at extreme angles that load, we can obviously cause structural damage or failure with extreme load factors. But the other reason is that it's important is that a higher load factor or at heavier weights, we have a higher angle of attack. So obviously that increases your stall speed. At a normal clean configuration in a lot of aircraft, GA aircraft, you might have a stall speed of 65 miles an hour. We can use the flaps to change the chord line of the wing, which will decrease the overall AOA, which decreases our load factor, or decreases the stalling speed, so probably around 50 miles an hour or something. But the heavier the plane is, remember we have lift and weight, right? So in order to compensate for increased weight, we need to generate more lift. And the only way that we can generate more lift is by having an increase in AOA. So the higher the AOA, the closer you are to getting to your critical angle of attack and stalling it. So the heavier that you are, you're going to stall at higher airspeeds. It's the same thing with load factor, right? So what we're doing with increasing the AOA is increasing the load factor. So in a high bank turn, we have something, for example, for commercial pilot's license, you have to do what's called an induced stall, meaning get the plane configured for cruise, 90 miles an hour, somewhere thereabouts, leave the power where it's at, and then start a 40-degree bank, and the plane will stall at about 90 miles an hour, when normally your stall speed and landing configuration is going to be around 50 or 60. Because we're loading the plane. We're increasing the load factor on the wings, increasing the AOA. If that makes any sense. Vortices, talked about those. I think that's it probably for today. Do you guys understand any of that stuff? Any questions? Do you guys know about vortices, wingtip vortice avoidance? That's kind of an important one for flying GA airplanes, particularly around larger ones. Cool. No questions? Then I'll probably leave it. If you guys are interested, I might do more of these. Another big one was with flight planning and density altitude. My instructor gave me shit about that. It wasn't requested, no. What I'm doing, I wanted to put it out there, and hopefully people on YouTube, what I want to know is if I'm explaining this in a way that a person who is interested in aviation but with no background can understand it. That's my primary goal. When I teach this to my instructor, he pretends to be the stupid guy. So I explain something and he says, I don't get it. So I have to go back and try to find an easier way to explain it. So what I want to see is if people can understand this or if I need to find a different way to approach it, if that makes any sense. I will probably do one more of these because really the rest of the notebook and stuff, you guys don't care about how GPS stuff works. Maybe airspace, national airspace, and probably flight planning because that involves a lot of the stuff like true course, true heading, magnetic course, magnetic heading, compass heading, deviation, variation, and different types of altitudes and pressures and stuff like that. So I'll probably do that one next. I don't think that I'll make this a recurrent thing or a common thing unless anybody wants to know more. Because I think most of this is incredibly boring unless you actually have to do a flight test. So I'll probably be back tomorrow. We'll come back tomorrow and I'll do. Have you seen some of the videos of Austin done when explaining some of his stuff as updates and changes to X-Plane? I have not. What has he done? Am I gonna have to go back to X-Plane? I missed some of the stuff that I was doing in there, like I don't know. It was cool being able to do IFR flights and different types of aircraft. I really miss the 727 and the 732. But at the same time, when I get down and I sit at my computer, I'm like, hey, what am I going to do today? I would rather fly an F-14. "2020 stopped working at all for you about 2 weeks ago. Hey, jump on the DCS train. How you doing, Scott?" My voice is all already shot now, too. I did 2 hours of teaching earlier today, too. I don't know. You guys let me know if you want to see anything in particular. Like, for the flight planning and stuff, obviously I'm going to go through all the navigational terminology and atmospheric stuff. Particularly, what I want to concentrate on is pressure altitude versus density altitude, because those are hard to explain and difficult to conceptualize, I think. Different types of airspeed and also aeronautical charts, airspace, any of that stuff. If you want to see anything particular, let me know. Otherwise, tomorrow I'm just going to come back with the pressure altitude, density altitude stuff. You got thrown off of YouTube for what? What were you doing on YouTube, bud? Austin takes you to school for X-Plane 1140 Beta 3. All right, I'll watch that in a minute. I've been a good boy on YouTube. I think one of the days that Keeper was in here, we got into some spicy conversation. Which, if I wasn't doing predominantly aviation stuff, I think my tongue might get me into some trouble. I'll check it out. The other thing too about X-Plane FS 2020, I just do this stuff all day, right? I mean, like I fly all the time, and I'm doing particularly the CFI stuff, which is all I'm talking about. It's nice to be able to get in and blow some commies up in an F-14. So unless you guys have any other questions related to this stuff, I'm gonna call it there. I'll be back tomorrow. I'll do stuff on pressure altitude, density altitude, and different types of course deviation, all that kind of stuff. Ugh. Also, weight and balance. Weight and balance is ugh, that was not fun, and it involves a lot of math, which sucks. I'm not a math person. All right, guys. Good talking to you, Keeper. Good to see you always. Scott, thanks for stopping. I was wondering why I hadn't seen you much on YouTube. It's like Scott hasn't commented in a minute. Melon, what up, dude? Good to see you too, guys. I'll be back tomorrow if you guys are interested, doing some more flight lessons. And if you want to see or do you want me to talk about anything in particular, let me know. And if you're watching on YouTube, let me know if any of that stuff made any sense or if I'm just rambling completely. See ya. It's about to get trippy here. See you guys later. Peace.